Thank you for joining us this morning for another edition of Stump the Archivist from Washington State Archives. We'll be doing a similar webinar every month, so join us for future webinars too. No webinars will be the same. Research Archivist Tracy Rebstock is our host, and she'll be hosting all these Stump the Archivist webinars for the foreseeable future. This is primarily a Q&A, which will start after Tracy does a little talk about criminal records. After that, feel free to chime in with any questions or go ahead and put your questions in the comment section. That's actually a great way to do it. That way you don't forget your questions. You can throw them out there, and I'll go ahead and read the questions off for Tracy, and she'll answer them to everybody. And if you are looking for the chat so you can enter your question, there should be a little chat bubble on the bottom right side of your screen. And without further ado, Tracy, take it away.
Thank you, Jameson. Happy Friday to everyone. I want to say that we've had a lot of really great turnout for these, and I'm so grateful people love coming on and learning new things with this. I will say a little disclaimer. We have had some people ask me questions, like specific questions about things, and I will say that the Stump the Archivist is the whole idea of it is to help people with their research, like figuring out where to go or what type of records to use for their search. So I'm hoping I can help you with that. I did give a Stump the Archivist to the Clark County Genealogical Society in April, and they were able to stump me. So I will say it is possible to stump me because I definitely don't know everything. So I just want to put that out there as a disclaimer. And I do think it's fun because I think it's fun to learn new things and learn how to find out where to find records. So I will say that today I chose criminal records, but I do have some heartache about using the word criminal because sometimes the people in the criminal justice system are not necessarily criminals. So I want to just say that outright, but also say that a lot of the records we hold for this group of people actually can tell you a lot about how society was throughout time in the state of Washington. And then you can also find out things about social issues, things about race, things about religion, things about the Union, things about communism. All these things you can find in the criminal records that we hold at the Washington State Archives. So we have a couple different kinds in our collections. First, at the local level, there's often what they call a jail register, which is just literally that. Every single person who is entered into the local jail, whether that be city or county, there's often what they call a jail register. And some of these go back pretty far. We recently got a hold of the earliest one from the Olympia police jail at the time, and it was from 1887. So sometimes it goes back pretty far. And it gives some interesting information. So often it is the person who is being arrested. It'll say what their crime was, and some of the crimes are not crimes we would consider crimes now. Some of them are different crimes. It just depends. And then it also will give what maybe they had on them at the time of their arrest, the person who was the arresting officer, and then sometimes it'll give some information about where they went from there. Some people only spent some time overnight or a couple of days, and some people got transferred, and it'll talk about the transfer, which is information that a lot of people are looking for, because as people do family history or they do research projects, they will find some of their people end up in the justice system, and they kind of track where they went from here to there. So depending on the crime, you'll often see transfers. I'll say in the case of the Centralia tragedy, that happened in Centralia, Washington in 1919, the gentlemen who were arrested at that time, they were taken into the Lewis County jail, but then they were transferred to the Grace Harbor County jail, and then it says where they went from there. So that's really interesting to find like the different transfer pieces, and it will say in the register where they were transferred, why they were transferred, and any additional information on that. Often what ends up happening is someone contacts us and says, oh, I have a person, maybe an uncle or an aunt or a grandfather or great-grandfather, and it sounds like they ended up in Washington. I remember one of my first research requests was from a woman in Cincinnati, Ohio, which was really interesting because I was from Cincinnati and I just moved out to Washington State, so I thought it was really interesting to be working with somebody back from Cincinnati. But she had found this person listed as she was doing her family history, and he had left Cincinnati. I think he left his wife and children behind and set off for greener pastures, and then had changed his name a few times. But thankfully, it was close enough to the name that he had been given that she was able to kind of track him down. And she said, any chance you can find anything on him? And so I looked it up, and I was able to find, and this varies depending, but he was indeed spent some time in the Washington State Penitentiary, and he was arrested, I believe, for forgery, and he was serving a 3-year sentence or something like that. And he had had a lot of different aliases, which helped her out immensely. And then also there was a mugshot. She'd never seen a picture of him, so there was a picture of him. There was also an intake record that kind of gives some information, whatever they're willing to disclose. Sometimes it's family, sometimes it's next of kin, sometimes it's just something about their occupation. And then there was actually a file, a couple different files. So we have what we call a what they call a PIN file. We call it a PIN file, short for penitentiary file, but a file on many of the people who spent time in the penitentiary up until about 1920. There's a file which includes maybe letters written in from home or different papers that were filed about them and their time in the penitentiary. And then we have what we call a clemency file, which is usually part of the governor's file, which are petitions to the governor for their release of a prisoner. And in this case, this gentleman had left a wife and 11 children back in Cincinnati. And the Archdiocese of Cincinnati had actually sent a letter to the governor asking for him to be released back to his family so that their family would have some income. So it can have a lot of different records there. I'm going to show you a couple things we have up on the digital archives that can help with the search. So here's the digital archives. Hopefully you guys can see that. Give me a thumbs up if that's what you can see. Perfect. And if you go to collections and then scroll down to institution records, this will list the ones we do have currently. And the one that a lot of people will go into is the commitment register and mugshots. And that starts in 1887, goes to about 1946. And I think we're still in process with putting these up. But if you take a look, you can actually search by name and you can limit your date range. And if you hit browse the series, you can actually just take a look and see what's here. So you'll see a listing of different people. And I'll pick somebody from Snohomish County. So you can also look at their, this gives a shot. This is some of the earlier mug shots. And there's our gentleman down here at the bottom. It tells a little bit about what his crime was, his age, his hair, where he was born, what his occupation was, and kind of gives some discharge. Sometimes it'll say like when they were discharged. So this is actually the funny part about using date ranges. As archivists, we like to see the 4-digit year just because people could assume this is a different year, but this is 1895, not 1995. So. I'll back out of that and show the other type of record we have sometimes is where, like this one for the Vancouver Police Department, they were collecting records about criminals just to kind of, this is kind of like early, maybe instead of posting pictures in the post office or something like that, this is kind of the early crowd sharing between police departments of potential criminals in the area. And this lists possible criminals in the area and what their occupation was. And there's a woman, who had many aliases, who did a lot of work. She would pretend that she had gotten hit by like a streetcar, or she would fake an injury and then get money out of the streetcar industry, or her name was Maud. See if I can find her real quick. I can't remember if she's in here under her alias or under her actual name, so we'll find out. So here she is. So this is her. And she went under Maud Johnson, Maud Mitchell, Maud Bainey. She lived in Portland. She was from Kansas City, Missouri. But basically, she could do things, and she would sometimes, basically, she taught herself to be able to dislocate her shoulder, or to cough up blood, or do different things, so that she would, be injured, and then she would be taken in, and then she would file a claim against the streetcar company, and then she would get money. And it got to she reached a certain notoriety where she actually ends up being featured in a railroad magazine that says, "Beware of this woman," and it showed several pictures of her to be on the lookout for her, potentially swindling streetcar companies out of money. She looks very demure there in this picture with her high collar dress. But there's, she violated her parole. Now, this is interesting. The story behind her violating her parole is that, I didn't realize this, but apparently for certain instances, you could be sent home from your sentence to, like, let's say, to a family, like usually a family death, or something else, and then you would have to promise to return. And we may think of that now as like, who would promise to return to prison? But apparently they trusted people to return after they let them go. And if they didn't, they did things like this, so that they violated their parole and put out something for her arrest. So. It's interesting, a former Eastern Washington University student who now works for the city of Spokane actually did a lot of research on Maud Johnson. I think has written an article or two about her, and it's probably out there on the World Wide Web. So if you want to find out more about her, it's very fascinating. So that is all I have for my short introduction. And you do not have to ask me questions about criminal records. You can ask me questions about anything that you're working on right now that is of interest, and we'll go ahead and get started. Jameson, do you have any questions?
Yeah, we've got a raised hand there. So Tessa, since you raised your hand, go ahead and ask a question out loud. And while she's asking her question, if anybody has a question, go ahead and enter it in the chat. Go ahead, Tessa, sorry.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm doing a narrative nonfiction book on early Italians in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm specifically looking for photographs. And I didn't really see a lot, and I'm not quite sure if I'm searching correctly. So I go into the photograph collection and I type in Italians, and there's like only like less than a handful. And so I'm not, I mean, is that true, or I'm just not searching correctly? I wonder if you can help me with that.
That is a perfectly good question. A lot of people ask us about that, especially if they're doing family history or just early history of anybody, whether that's the Jewish community or Native Americans, or, like, how do we find these photographs? And the thing of it is, believe it or not, we don't have a lot of photographs in our collections.
Okay.
Just because, think about it, we are primarily a government archive, and so it's basically like based on government records that are created. Now, it doesn't mean we don't have photographs. It just means that a lot of times the photographs we have are created by government agencies, and the trick is to figure out, well, what photographs would the government agencies would have taken of these people. So I will say looking through the penitentiary records for Italian names may be a way to do it.
Okay.
As well as I believe we're in the process of still working on some oral histories that have been done. You'll see a link to the Black oral histories, but I think there was or may have been some Italian oral histories listed in that as well, but they just may not be up yet. So you can always contact us and say, hey, do you have anything on Italian Americans and, when they came in, and how would I find that, or how can I research that? And then the other piece of it is you may want to contact a local historical society that may have, if an area was a lot of Italians moved into that area early on, that may be the place to look for those, for more images from that time period. Also, if you know what sorts of work they were doing, like if they were logging or if they were in the cannery business or something like that, that may be another way to kind of go into that. A lot of times the images for people, there's not, unfortunately, the most people-oriented pictures we have are the mugshots. But that is to say, sometimes like parades or festivals or types of things like that may show up as well. Or let's say there's a family picnic at a park or something. Sometimes that'll show up in our records as part of our Parks and Recreation or something like that. But it's kind of like, it's almost like you have to think about, well, so how would they end up in images beyond just the family photographs, right? Like how would you end up beyond that? And it's tricky because you're like, well, let's think about some different ways or different places where people would have gotten their images taken, and what would that look like? Now, our state library has some images as well. You can check in with them. A lot of theirs are hosted as part of our collections on the digital archives. But I would say you'd be surprised how many local historical societies have great image collections.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I hadn't thought to think to check the penitentiary records, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, because there might have been some mob activity, like in the 20s and 30s. So that's a very good point. And yes, I have been speaking to various historical societies. And so, but I like the way you're having me think, like how I frame the question, like where would they be involved and why would the government be having pictures, and figure that out, even from professions. You're certainly right. Even certain areas, I know Cle Elum Ellensburg has a big Italian community. There's a lot of information from cemetery records as well. So I'll be looking at that. Walla Walla too, because they had a lot of farmers there. So yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. I want to say, I think Cle Elum may actually have some of their images available online. I cannot remember where that's through, but I believe that to be the case.
Okay.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, Jane, I saw your hand up first.
Yes, I have a comment to make on Tessa's question. I was actually recently doing some research on Italians in Tacoma myself, and I found that Governor Rossellini's father is in the penitentiary records. He and a cousin were apparently drug smuggling.
Okay, thank you, Jane. That's great. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Awesome. I love the crowdsourced of common knowledge that everybody has here, right? Absolutely. All right. All right, Carol, I see your hand up.
Yes, the Northwest Room at the Tacoma Public Library System recently inherited from the nearly defunct Tacoma News Tribune newspaper their entire archive of journalist photographs. And so you might want to check there. I'm not sure they're all sorted yet, but one other thing to think about is that when the Italians came, they started their own churches where Mass was in Italian, Catholic churches especially. So the Catholic, I don't know if it would be an archdeacon or a bishop or who has charge of Washington State records, might have a lot of information there with photographs.
Yeah, that's a great point. The archdiocese, I have I have researched because my book takes into account Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. So I do know that there are certain churches that are called the Italian churches. So that's a very good point to actually reach out to the Archdiocese. That's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I really hope you find the drug smuggling with the Rossellini's. I go for that, please, so we can all read it.
That's a great one. Yeah, you're right. Thank you so much.
Carol, you want to go ahead and ask the question that you sent?
Yeah, would the jail records or the penitentiary records have any kind of list of visitors of who came to visit the prisoners? And then also, would any of those records have the names of the lawyers who represented them, or the names of the prosecutors who prosecuted them? Or would those be under court proceedings?
Good question. Most of those will be in the court proceedings. However, we do happen to have we don't have all the visitor logs from all time, but we do have a very early subset of visitor records. So depending on the time period, we may have some visitor logs from the penitentiary. I don't think we have anything like that for any of the jail records. But if you look for, if they're in the penitentiary and had either a clemency file or really early on had their PIN file, you can actually see who corresponded with the inmate, or who may have corresponded on behalf of the inmate. And that may give you some clues as to where else to look. All right, thank you.
All right, you ready for the next question?
Yes.
All right, Steve would like to know, how do I research old homes in North Snohomish County, Island County, and Skagit County, including their builders and original owners?
Okay, that's a good question. We could do, as I've said before on this, we could do a whole thing on land. I could probably do like a whole week on land and building research. So depending on the homes and how stylish they are. So occasionally, if you have a home that is like pretty monumentally built and it's like the only one of its kind in the area, you may be able to find newspaper articles about who the builder was and when the builder went in, because that's the sort of thing they would write about in the local newspaper, especially if it was like out of the norm for like what was built in the area. So if it was like the biggest home in whatever town, there'll be a lot about it. If the builder was a famous architect, then sometimes those building plans still exist with the architect or the architecture's company. If the company still exists, they may still have some of the drawings. If they are no longer around, oftentimes some of the architecture firms would have turned over their records to like a university, to their alma mater or something like that, so that they could live on through time. So you can sometimes do some searching for that. If the builder was not well known, or was only well known in their area, it gets a little more tricky. So I know in the case of my home in Olympia, Washington, it is hugely possible it was a kit home done by the Tumwater Lumber Company. I was able to find a catalog online of the Tumwater Lumber Company and find a pretty close version of what I think my house would have been, as it was built in 1925. It hasn't changed much since it was built. But there was a series of homes that went in that were built probably during that time period. So that's something else you could kind of look at. In the case of my grandparents' house, they ordered their house through Sears and Roebuck, and it was shipped via rail, and they put it together themselves, on the farm. So then you can kind of trace the Sears and Roebuck kit catalogs. Some of those are out online and some of them are not, but you can actually kind of piece together what that is. But to actually do the land research for property, you can either start at the beginning of time at the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management site, put in the township and range and the section of that area to find out who originally had the land patent through the United States government. And then you can kind of slowly trace it through with the county records, either the grantor and grantee volumes or doing the deed research. But I always tell people to start with what you know. and narrow down some searches. The other thing to do is to look at some old city and county directories to see who lived in the house over time, because that can help you with names when you want to try to find the deeds themselves, because the deeds in the grantor grantee volumes are by name. And then the land description is really important. So a lot of times the land description will be listed next to which volume and page the deed is on, and that can help. Of course, after a while, people didn't like writing out the land description, so they wrote "see record" in the grantor grantee volume. So if you have somebody who owned a lot of land and was selling and buying a lot of land, that can make that challenging. And most of the land records in the archives go up to about the 1980s, and then from that point onward, they're in auditors' recording systems or in daily recordings, which is a little more tricky to look at, but not impossible. And then I have a worksheet from the City of Olympia's historic preservation from a long time ago that I pulled off their page, which kind of gives you a snapshot of what types of records could be available and where they're located. And it's based on Olympia and Thurston County, but you could interchange the city and county for anything else and kind of give you a place to start. And if you would like me to send you that sheet, you can email us at research@sos.wa.gov, and I'll have Jameson put our email address in the chat box. And I can get you started on that. The Snohomish and Island counties records are going to be with our Northwest Regional Branch in Bellingham, and you could contact them with kind of like first steps and how you'd like to go. I usually recommend getting the parcel cards if they're available, because that can often give you a snapshot in time of who owned the property and the taxes for that time period, and sometimes a footprint of a house, and sometimes a photograph of a house.
I'll add on to that just that about a year ago, my mom asked me to see if I could find the location of a ranch that belonged to her great aunt and uncle, I guess my great great aunt and great great uncle, that was in Snohomish County. And so I emailed the Northwest branch with the names of the two people, and they were able to dig up the exact location of where that ranch was in like a half an hour at most. And also, not only that, but we found out that my great great uncle's name was actually not what we thought it was all that time.
Yeah, land research can be easy and it can be difficult, but it's really, really rewarding. I was talking to a gentleman today on the phone about a land research in Pierce County having to do with the changing of the direction of a river and people's land abutting that, which is always fascinating. So yeah, good stuff, land research. All right, next question. Oh, Jane, go ahead.
Actually, this is Sandy. What about criminal records in the 60s? Would they be available on the digital archives?
So I think most of our stuff on the digital archive stops in about 1946 or so. And so after that, and a lot of it has to do with the way the records changed over time. So we do hold what we call face sheets or index cards that kind of talk about people's time in the penitentiary that are more modern, but they are not as well arranged. So we have a giant project going on that kind of got paused because of COVID, where people are helping us index the face sheets that we have so that we're able to find them, because they come to us not necessarily in chronological order, but by the release date. And so if you know the release date, we're able to kind of narrow down whether or not we would have a face sheet. So in this way, we work a lot with Department of Corrections to help people find face sheets from like the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. But having that release date is really important for us to be able to track that down.
So do you think going to like Iowa, if you're arrested for an accident on a highway, would that be a sheriff's department?
So that's a good question. So it depends on where you are. So if you're on a state highway, it's usually the state patrol that does that.
The 1940s?
It could be, right? Or it could be the county, if the county had a county sheriff. If you're in a incorporated place, it's usually the local police, but a lot of places could not afford to have a local police department, so they often would contract with the county sheriff's office.
Yes, I was wondering if I could find sheriff's records like the ones that you have with mugshots.
It's highly probable, yes. So I would say anything we have here in Washington probably is replicated in other states. And it's just a question of finding out what their hierarchy was at the time. Like, did they have a local PD, or was it just a sheriff, or did they have a highway patrol at the time?
Mm-hmm.
I am not up on my dates with when our state highway patrol began.
Okay.
But I think it was pretty early. So yeah, depending on
trying to figure out how to contact who to ask those questions.
So I think that Iowa does have a state archives.
Okay.
So you could check there if you'd like. And then depending on the county courthouses are really actually often full of great information, especially in Iowa. And I know this because my family's from Iowa. And so I've done some research in Pottawatomie, Cass, and Audubon counties. So
I got Pottawatomie. Love that name.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
State Archives.
All right. Do you have any more questions? I don't have any new ones in the chat yet, so if anybody has a question, go ahead and raise your hand or put it in the chat.
So what that house paper on houses from Olympia, Thurston County, what would I ask for? What title does that have to ask you for?
Just say I'd like to do property research. Can you send me that handout you have?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Tessa?
Yes, I forgot to ask, what attribution, I think that's the right word, if I do use a photograph I find in the digital archives, and do I have to pay for it?
You don't have to pay for it. We do have them listed in there, which ones are in the public domain and which ones are not. There's not very many that we've shared on our digital archives that are not in the public domain, but just double check. And it usually has like a preferred citation when you pull up the actual record. And all we ask is that you just cite us that you used it. And if you need a higher resolution image than what you find on the digital archives, just shoot us an email and we can see what we can get for you. Sometimes we can't, sometimes we can.
That's true, right. And the email is the research@sos. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
We usually have really high resolution images already online.
Yeah, we try, but some of our older stuff doesn't.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah,
Still,
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you for that.
All right. I know there are questions out there. Don't be shy.
I can just tell you stories. You guys don't want me telling you stories.
Any stories you have, please tell us, because your stories are wonderful.
Thank you. All right. So not Jane.
Yep, Sandy again.
It says Jane Nelson. Sandy.
I was just thinking, what about accident reports? Is that something that can be looked up from early on?
Yes, it can. So it depends. Again, it kind of depends on where it's from. So there are early on accidents. There is some records with that. Actually, if you notice, I think there's a set of records on the digital archives. Let me pop that up really quick because I feel like it's there. Let me share my screen here.
I'm trying to think of the county. It's over Port Angeles area.
I want to say it's let's see. We'll go out of here. And I'll go back to here. I feel like it's under photographs. Let me see here. I want to say it was like, it's either Clark County. Let me see.
Clark County wouldn't help you.
There was a, So some of them will have like that is something where you could find sometimes photographs of a traffic accident. But if it happened happens in a like a incorporated city, it would be potentially the city police that would have it. But keep in mind, everything that's happened over time. As fascinating as it is to us, we can't keep everything. So sometimes we just keep like a sampling of what the procedurals would have been at that time. So the older it is, the more likely you may have it. The more modern it is, the less likely. But for fatality case files that happen on the state highways, the State Patrol does keep files and investigations on those. So, but there are some restrictions with those because of how modern they are, right? I want to say
think of an accident that happened near Port Angeles.
Port Angeles.
No, not Port Angeles. Yeah. So, and the person did eventually die, though, in Seattle.
So this is an example of sometimes there'll be this is from 49. I don't know if you can see this, but.
Oh, gosh. How awful. Clark County.
Crashed into a building.
Wow.
And a lot of times you'll find them with the public works because it maybe had to do with the roads. Sometimes if, like, let's say someone had an accident because the roads were bad, the public works department would take pictures of it so that they could do the repairs. And so sometimes they don't end up under like the police or the sheriffs, but they end up in public works images.
Oh, yeah. Oh, all kinds of great ideas here.
It's all about trying to figure out, and that's the thing. It's always like, well, I'm looking for this thing, but where do you think it would have happened? In what way would the government have been involved in what I'm looking for? And then that's what directs you to records in the archives, the state archives.
Sure, my accident, they had to fix the barrier.
Right.
Yeah, I wonder if they'd have my accident on Snoqualmie Pass, where they had to fix the barrier after. That's kind of more recent.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions out there?
I have a question. This is Leah Connor. I'm sorry I logged in really late. I was helping somebody trying to find about a relative that they found was buried up near Davenport in this little rural cemetery, and it looks like a new tombstone, which makes me suspicious about when this person might have died, and we can't find any information about him. And I'm wondering, when did Washington start requiring burial transit permits? Because I suspect that would be a better clue of when he died and where he died.
Yes, that is a good question. I do not know off the top of my head when they started that, but you could check on the Washington Association for Cemeteries. They might have a little bit of their history on there. And if not, I've got a couple other ideas we could search for to see when they started with that. Because I would say a lot of the burials that happened early on in Washington, it was just a handshake and a signing at the cemetery. They just signed in, who went in which plot, kind of a thing. It wasn't regulated till later, and that would have been done by law. So I could do a little background if you want to shoot me an email.
Okay, so just give me a second. I'm going to write this down. Where should I send the email to?
So research.
Okay.
At SOS.
Yes.
.wa.
Okay.
.gov.
And do I put it attention to anybody in particular?
Attention Tracy, Tracy.
Okay. Yeah, because this guy that was asking, he had a relative that came to, this is really interesting, he came to Spokane as I guess like on a railroad or something to work here, and then ended up homesteading and just up and died. And I could find him, I think it was last in like there was some reference to him in 1890 or something. in some document. There wasn't a census then, but there was some other document referencing him, and that was the last that I could find of the guy. But there's this tombstone that's very modern, not worn, and it's clearly something that somebody's done since then, but there's no record anywhere of when he died or where he died. So kind of interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Also keep in mind for death records in the state of Washington, it was in 1890 when the law changed for when the law started in Washington for there to be some sort of, if there was a medical professional at the time there, they would have to record it. And then in 1891, they kind of changed that a little bit. And then by 1907, they were essentially collecting death records at the Department of Health. And I would say there were a lot of deaths that occurred in Washington all the way up until about the 1920s that may or may not have been recorded, except for maybe in the most important of places, the Bible or at the cemetery. So,
oh no, I'm familiar with that because I've got an aunt that's buried under a roadway down in Lincoln County, Oregon. She died in like oh no, this is really funny. She died. I mean, it's not funny, but she died in 1887. Her family walked from Nebraska to Oregon in 1885, and sometime after that she got sick and died. And the only reason I know she's under the roadway was that there was a rumor about it, and I bought this very large book of lost graves, and it said that she died in 1903. I'm like, no, she didn't, because I've got it's an old family Bible that references the date of her death, but it doesn't say where she's buried. And it does. And in this book, it says she's buried under the roadway at milepost 5.8. And I got a hold of a guy in the Public Works Department down there that's a little bit of a history nut. And he actually went and tracked down the grave. And it's kind of this little local thing where it's always rumored that, so-and-so is buried here or whatever, but nobody was really sure. There's just some bricks there, and people put flowers by the side of the road.
oh my.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. But did people purchase grave sites back then, or did they just get buried, like at around 1890, or were they just buried?
Yeah, they would have still. Purchasing a plot. I mean, if it wasn't a family cemetery, like a family cemetery, people just buried the family in the family cemetery. But if it was like a little church cemetery, the church would have said that their parishioners could have plots there. They may or may not have had some money exchange. If it was a little city cemetery, they would have sold plots. And oftentimes the sale of that plot is actually either registered in a city register or in the county county indexes between the grantor or grantee as a bill of sale for a certain
maybe that's
plot.
A place to check then.
Yep.
Okay, good enough. Thank you.
You're welcome.
From my personal experience, replacing a headstone is not all that uncommon. I know of two people in my family or wife's family whose tombstones have been replaced. One, someone who died in the early 1950s. His family at the time was very poor, so they couldn't invest very much in a headstone. It looked like just the broadside of a cinder block with a name written on it. And of course, that had been, after not very many years, was almost worn to the point of not being able to read it anymore. And it was replaced like last year. So it's an extremely modern looking headstone for someone who died 70 years ago. And also, my wife's father passed away like 15 years ago, and we're already talking about replacing that headstone. But that's mostly because they put a photo on it with like the worst haircut of his entire life. So they won't let us change the photo. They are going to make us change the entire tombstone. So.
Oh, that's funny. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure, no problem. I look forward to hearing from you.
All right, thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions out there? We're getting a little low on time, so if you got a question, now's the time. Either put it in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute yourself and start talking. That works too.
Well, I have an answer for the modern headstone. My cousins and I did that at the old historic graveyard in Yakima, the town of Yakima, and we had to fill out a whole lot of paperwork to get that headstone replaced with something that was modern. So if this cemetery if it's not just someplace out in the wild, if someone is managing it or owns it, there's going to be a record of who replaced that stone, and there's the beginning of your tracking.
Great idea, Carol. Absolutely. Yeah. All right, Susan, I see your hand up.
I found the name. His name was Andrew Olson, and he supposedly died in 1897. And where he is buried is, let's see, where does it say? I know it's right on your way into Davenport, but the bigger issue was that the cemetery did track down, like where it has its website. It's one of those little cooperative community things. Their contact person died. Like there's an email address for that person, and I emailed them, and I went, and nobody responded. So I ended up trying to look up this person and found out they're dead. So I don't know who the contact person is for the cemetery anymore.
It is possible the local historical society or genealogical society may know. And then it's also possible they would not.
Okay.
Another place to check, this is Millie from DSHS, is Western State Hospital, for example, has maintained its own cemetery, and it was established in 1871. And in the good old days, they used to do medical treatment for people could walk in and get normal medical treatment if that's what they needed. So, I mean, they had a staff where they had, physicians on it that could handle more than just mental issues. And I don't know, but it's possible that Eastern State Hospital in Eastern Washington may have done the same thing. So that's just another place to check.
Good enough. Thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Westlaw. They say, I had an individual approach me stating he was adopted, but according to his adoption record, it stated he is a Native American from the Lakota area. I recommended him reaching out to the tribe there, or is there somewhere else to look?
So I think reaching out to the tribe may be one way to do it. And then also depending on the area, a lot of adoptions happen through, it depends on whether or not it was a public or private adoption. That's the other piece of it, is to find out if there's any clues on the adoption paperwork that say whether it was done via the state or if it was done by a private entity. And that might be the way to get started with that. Although I will say I know for here in Washington State, there's a lot of adoption agencies that have gone under, and a lot of their records are not, they're lost, or I think they're supposed to turn them over to the state, but I'm not sure if they always do. So
I'm a lawyer, and I can tell you a little bit more about the adoption process. Okay. If he was born in another state, there's going to be a record, in this case with the tribe, wherever that tribe is located, and they will have to consent to the adoption, and then there'll be a second reciprocal adoption that happens in Washington State. I swear to God, and it's really strange.
Thank you very much. We get a lot of questions about adoption, so I always like to have someone on speed dial to ask about adoptions. For sure.
Feel free to call me anytime. I'll email you my information, but I actually do adoption searches as a volunteer. I don't want everybody calling me, but from time to time, maybe about 5 a year, I'll pick up somebody that's hit brick walls. And as a volunteer, I can't be paid for it because it's a law-related service. I will find out who their birth family is and get as much information for them. And a lot of times they passed at that point, but I'm really good at finding people.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And another resource is the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, DCYF.
Yes.
So
DCYF,
there are,
right?
Yeah, because way back when when everybody merged, because you're right, a lot of the adoption services were, they were just local entities that did that. But then when the agencies were formed, Children's Administration has adoption records from way back if it was handled, because because a lot of adoptions in the day were people just taking on other people's children, so it's very possible there are no records, but that's just another place to check.
Thank you very much, Millie. You're always a wealth of information for that. I appreciate it.
I see we have a hand up, but real quick, Carol had a follow-up to the headstone. She said that one way to track a new headstone is to look for the closest business that produce local headstones. They could have records too. That's a clever resource.
That's a good idea. Absolutely. All right, Susan.
Yes, my question is about Okanagan County records.
Okay.
Really back early ones. I'm a scribe volunteer, so I know some new ones pop up on Scribe to be transcribed occasionally, but not very often. And in the past, when I've seen indication that there were new records for that area, you go to Okanagan County and it says nothing. Does that mean that they're still unscanned and so they're not available to be transcribed, or is there a way to know questions like that?
That's a good question. So Okanagan just recently started transferring records to the archives. And I don't know, the best person to ask is our central regional branch archivist, Bridget. Right. She will know kind of like what's been coming in. And then it's a question of then scanning, right? So sometimes the county has done scanning projects and then they share their image with us, or other times we do scanning projects and then possibly share the images with the county. So Bridget will know more about what's happening with scanning for Okanagan, or if Okanagan has done a scanning project for the early stuff. And then also be able to confirm which years of records she's recently taken in. Because I know that's something that's happened. I want to say that's happened in the last 2 years.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We'd have a follow-up on the Lakotas from our very own Allison. She said also looks like both North and South Dakota, where the Lakota people are traditionally located, both offer adoption records search programs. All right, do you want to try and take one more question? It's 10:57.
I've got 3 minutes. Do we have one more question? All right, Millie, you're up.
This is very interesting. Are you planning on doing more of these in the future?
I do them every third Friday, and I plan to do it every third Friday from now until
third Friday of every month.
Yeah, sorry, the third Friday of every month, right? Sorry.
Same time?
Same time, 10 to 11 a.m. I have not decided. Actually, the one thing I've not decided is what I'm going to introduce next. How I'm going to introduce next week's records.
So maybe I'll talk. I mean, will people still have to register for it, and will you be sending out the sign-on information then?
Yes.
Okay, good.
We'll also be posting a link to join the meeting on Facebook, like right before the meeting starts, just in case there's anybody who missed the registration. So, I mean, that's just another option. But yeah, it would be best to just register for it, because
usually Jameson sends it out about this week of, just so it doesn't drop off people's radar that it's happening or whatever. So, and then I have not, I'll admit, somebody asked me if I have a topic. I don't know. I've been literally just winging it on the topic of the day before I get started. And I think I've done so far. I know I can go back and watch it, but I have not put on a list of that. Keep in mind that even if I talk about a topic, doesn't mean your question has to have anything to do with that topic. It can literally have anything about your research that you're curious about is kind of up for grabs after I talk a little bit about something. So
I have a topic.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm curious, and I've been doing reading on it, but I'd like to know how the influenza of, I think, 1917, how that impacted Washingtonians, and because I think that I've read about it, but I never lived it until COVID.
Right.
And I would just, I would like to know if there were records or information about what things they did and what things they faced and how it would compare to COVID.
Okay, Millie.
I mean, I'm sure they did not have technology.
Challenge accepted, Millie. Next week, I will introduce with the influenza and how it affected Washington.
Well, I have a million of them, so
Good to know. Good to know. Public health records. Yes, it's always a good one. So I'll remember. Put that in my. Jameson, remind me, or Allison, remind me, or anybody else who's on here, remind me. Devrick, remind me. But I said I'd do public health records, specifically the 1918 influenza. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed doing this. I hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.